If you've ever heard of Jesus of Nazareth, you probably know he was a famous teacher, and his most well-known words have shaped the lives of billions of people throughout history.
Love your neighbor as yourself. Do to others what you would have them do to you.
Now, those sayings come from a collection of Jesus' teaching that's sometimes called the Sermon on the Mount. It's only 3 chapters long, but its ideas and images have endured throughout time.
You are the salt of the earth. You can't serve both God and money. Take the plank out of your eye before you take the speck out of another's.
In the sermon are some really challenging teachings.
If anyone strikes you on the cheek, turn and offer him the other cheek. Love your enemy and bless those who persecute you.
And there are also some really puzzling teachings.
If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off?
But the Sermon on the Mount is not a random collection of Jesus' teachings. They've been organized in a beautiful way so that it's easier to remember and meditate on. There are 3 main parts of the sermon, the middle of which has 3 parts, and then each of those middle parts themselves have 3 parts.
Wow, the sermon has been carefully designed.
Yes, and right at the center of the center is the famous prayer that Jesus taught his followers.
Our Father in heaven, may your name be treated as holy. May your kingdom come. May your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Well, what does that mean for God's kingdom to come on earth?
Well, we have to remember that Jesus was Jewish, and he grew up meditating on the Hebrew Bible, the sacred scriptures of Israel, and they told the story of God and all humanity.
How God created a well-ordered world and appointed humans to rule it on his behalf.
And when humans rule with God's wisdom and love, and when justice and peace prevail, and there's enough for everyone, that is God's kingdom and God's will being done here on earth as it is in heaven.
And that's no easy task. Humans foolishly rebel and start building their own kingdoms by their own wisdom.
And so God chose one family, the Israelites, and he offered them his wisdom. It was called the Torah, which in Hebrew means the teaching. And beginning with Moses on Mount Sinai, God entered into a sacred covenant with them.
Why only select one family?
Well, the goal was for the Israelites to be transformed by God's wisdom so that they could represent God's kingdom before all the nations.
But in Jesus' day, God's kingdom was nowhere to be seen. In fact, Israel was under the thumb of Roman oppressors. So what happened? Why isn't God's kingdom coming?
Well, many religious leaders, like the scribes and the Pharisees, they thought it wasn't coming because Israel wasn't being faithful enough to the Torah. Other leaders, called the Sadducees, thought it would be best if Israel found a way to cooperate with Rome, and so they became the power brokers of Jesus' day.
Some ran for the hills to become freedom fighters against Rome.
They're known as the Zealots.
And still others withdrew to the desert, waiting for God to use them to start a new Israel.
But walk around the hill country of Israel, like Jesus did, and you'll mostly find normal people, figuring out their lives as best they can. Most were barely hanging on, lots of poor and sick people. Many had lost their land to the Roman occupiers and were struggling to pay the heavy taxes.
They were powerless and hopeless.
And so Jesus went to these people, healing the sick and announcing that God's kingdom was arriving. People gathered from all over to hear his teachings, and one day, Jesus went up to a tall hill and said the arrival of God's kingdom was starting here and now with them.
You mean with the powerless, the weak, the nobodies? God's kingdom begins here?
Yes, this is why the very first line of the Sermon on the Mount is, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." In other words, where can you go and see God's presence and blessing springing to life? Among the rich? Among the powerful? No, Jesus says. Look where people are poor, where they feel crushed and defeated. God's kingdom is beginning with the people standing right here.
Well, good morning. Another great resource from the team at the Bible Project there. In case we haven't met, my name is DJ. If you're visiting with us, I'm super pleased and thrilled that you are here amongst us this morning, and please do avail yourself of a coffee or even a cool drink afterwards on the house. And if you're willing, I'd love to meet you and chat with you. Have the joy of being the lead pastor here with a wonderful team at New Vine. It's a pleasure and a joy and a privilege to be part of such a great team and part of such a great church family. So, Happy New Year! Hey, let me start with a question this morning. Has there ever been a time in your life where a few minutes changed the course and trajectory of your life? Maybe for ill, but maybe also for good. A small change, but a big impact. Well, while you're thinking about it, let me just share with you one of 2 times that 10 minutes changed my world. The first happened when I was 17. Anybody else here 17? A few 17s? Who would like to be 17 again? Yeah, indeed. Well, when I was 17, I was singing a duet at a high school performance night with a friend of mine. Afterwards, the parents of another friend came up to me and we were chatting for just a few minutes. And as they turned to leave, one of them said to me, "Have you ever thought about performing professionally?" It was a moment, maybe you've had them, where time just sort of seems to catch its breath, while the words sank into somewhere deep in my sense of who I was and who I was meant to be and to become. Until that 5-minute conversation, I'd never dared dream that I was anywhere good enough as a performer to consider it as a career. But that conversation created a seismic shift in my sense of possibility and a seismic shift in the direction that my life took that's led me to where I am today. Because within a year, I'd auditioned for my first full-time touring gig, the start of 5 years of professional performing across Australia. As a sidebar, never underestimate the power of your words to shape someone's pathway in life. For good, or sometimes for ill. At my dad's funeral, I picked up this bookmark. When words are both true and kind, they can change the world. Anyone experienced that kind of powerful encouragement, something true and kind? Well, my friend's parents' words that night literally encouraged me. They gave me the courage to pursue an opportunity that I would never have considered otherwise. 5 minutes on stage, followed by a 5-minute conversation. Together, 10 minutes that changed my world. Well, what are the moments, the minutes, the words which maybe have changed your life, particularly for good? A moment that made you believe. The minutes that dared you to dream. A conversation that set you towards a new destination. Maybe it was a New Year's resolution that stuck. Of course, most of them don't, do they? But maybe this was one that mattered enough to you for it to stick and start to change your life. Well, Justin and Jody both talked about New Year's resolutions this morning. But today, as Zach intimated, we want to start a new series that invites us not just to make those fleeting New Year's resolutions, but that invites us into a New Year's revolution. Because this is a sermon, as Zach said, that's based on 10 minutes that changed the world. And I'm talking, of course, about Jesus' most famous teaching, summarized in 10 minutes reading time and called today the Sermon on the Mount. Of course, Jesus didn't call it that. He didn't say, "Come on up, I'm going to give you a Sermon on the Mount." But that's what we know it as. 3 chapters in Matthew's Gospel in the New Testament of the Bible. A little over 2,000 words at an average reading speed, 10 minutes to read. But as I say, it's 10 minutes that changed the world. As the Bible Project team said a little earlier, Jesus' words in this sermon have shaped the lives of billions of people throughout history since. In fact, the Sermon on the Mount has had an immeasurable impact on the history of the last 2,000 years. Its teachings have not only shaped the spirituality and lives of believers, but the sermon transformed entire cultural value systems in the early centuries after Jesus. Firstly, of the church, and then of society. The sermons focus on turning the other cheek, blessing those who persecute you, loving your enemies, and caring about the poor and oppressed subverted the Roman Empire's views of justice, power, honor, and dominance by might. Jesus' call to non-violence, to humility, to mercy, and peacemaking introduced a completely new way of thinking about human social relations. One that was initially countercultural in its rejection of violence, revenge, hatred, and the pursuit of personal gain, all of which were endemic in the value systems of the ancient world. And what was initially countercultural then began to shape culture. The concept of the common good, which became central in Western philosophy and political thought, finds a moral foundation in the sermon's emphasis on self-sacrificial love, the moral duty to care for others, especially those in need. And the values in the Sermon on the Mount arguably spawned the ideas that we take for granted today, ideas of human rights, of civil rights, and of social justice. To give you just a few brief examples. Anybody guess who this is? Be bold. William Wilberforce, thanks. Good job. William Wilberforce, the slave trade abolitionist, was compelled by the Christian call to love one's neighbor and the moral equality of all people, along with some of his other abolitionists. He was inspired by the Sermon on the Mount's words, to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This is Francis Willard, who successfully fought for a maximum 8-hour workday and also for women's rights to vote. Francis Willard saw the Sermon on the Mount as a vision of how the world could and should be. Famously, Martin Luther King was convinced by the Sermon on the Mount that his civil rights movement in the late 50s and 60s should adopt the principle of non-violence, loving one's enemies, blessing those who persecute you, even while standing and fighting for, in a non-violent way, for a society in which justice, equality, and peace should prevail. But outside of the Christian tradition, the Sermon on the Mount also was deeply influential. For example, on Mahatma Gandhi, the great Indian independence leader, who said that it is the Sermon on the Mount which endeared me to Jesus. Gandhi's biographer, Vincent Sheen, wrote that Gandhi was so penetrated with the truth and beauty he felt in the verses of the sermon, that's the Sermon on the Mount, that through years of effort, he actually became something like a summation of the Beatitudes, the meek, the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemaker. His reverence for Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount illumined his long struggle and gave him strength for it. So why has it proven so influential even to those of different faiths and even of no faith? Well, perhaps because it challenges us to rise above our baser natural human instincts, to live to a higher standard, to live lives of goodness inside and out. Or perhaps because at the heart of the Sermon on the Mount, there is a vision of a radically different world, a different way of being together in the world. One where the poor in spirit are blessed, where the meek inherit the earth, and the peacemakers are called children of God, where love and fairness and authenticity triumph over hate and hypocrisy. Perhaps because it is a call to live aligned with a new reality that Jesus called the kingdom or the reign of God. A call that has not just shaped Christian lives as we've seen, but has captured the ethical imagination of the broader world in many places and at many times and in many people. In other words, the Sermon on the Mount is 10 minutes that change the world. Here's the thing. It can also change your world and my world. But for all its beauty and power and impact, the Sermon on the Mount isn't always easy to understand or easy to follow. Are we really to pluck out our eye, cut off our hands, if we can't keep to the high standards that Jesus seems to set? How are we to understand it? Is it, as St. Augustine said in the 5th century, the perfect standard, the perfect measure of the Christian life? If so, are we meant to literally obey it in every detail? And if so, is it intended or only possible for a special class of Christians, like the monks of old, or maybe pastors, God forbid, or particularly dedicated spiritual kind of followers of Jesus today? Or is Jesus, as Martin Luther thought, intentionally setting up an impossible ideal that helps us realize how far we fall short and thus see the depths of God's grace and forgiveness? Or should we, as many Christians have done, either kind of disregard it or find ways to water down and explain the hard teachings away to make them a bit more realistic, more achievable, or at least a bit more palatable? Should we just put it in the too hard basket? Well, we're going to look at some of those options in the series, but one way to read it that we're going to more or less follow in this series is that the Sermon on the Mount points us towards the good life according to Jesus. That is a blueprint for human flourishing amid the brokenness of our world. A blueprint that exists, of course, in tension. The tension of living now in light of God's future for the world. And hence, it's a call to discipleship. That means to follow Jesus into the kingdom of God, the ultimate place of flourishing, justice, and peace. It's Jesus' manifesto, we might say, of living the good life now that anticipates what is yet to come in God's good world, in God's good time. Today, in the time we have left, we're just going to set the scene for what Jesus says in the sermon. And then over the coming weeks and months, we're going to take a deep dive into the riches of this most central and famous piece of Jesus' teaching. Because there is so much to be explored and to be applied in practice in the 21st century, just as in the first century. Now, if you're new to church or unfamiliar with the Bible, you'll find the Sermon on the Mount in a book that we call Matthew in the New Testament section of the Bible. Matthew, along with Mark, Luke, and John, tell the story of the life, death, and remarkable resurrection of Jesus. And a few chapters into Matthew's version, we find that the baby whose birth we celebrated just a few weeks ago at Christmas has all grown up and is traveling throughout his home region of Galilee in northern Israel. And he's starting to attract a lot of attention. Matthew summarizes it like this. Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in the Jewish synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God, or of heaven, as Matthew calls it, healing every disease and sickness among the crowds. News about him spread all over Syria, that's the neighboring region. Large crowds from Galilee, the Decapolis, or the 10 towns, Jerusalem in the south, and Judea, and the region across the Jordan followed him. Now, if your Middle Eastern geography is not that great, don't worry. You get the picture. And after that summary, Matthew begins chapter 5 with these words. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him and he began to teach them. Hence the name, the Sermon on the Mount. Anybody been to the Galilee region in northern Israel? Yep, Grace. Elaine has, yeah. Yoram and Alice. Others. Oh, I see, lots of hands. Fabulous. Well, if you have, you'll know that there's a place that's regarded by many as a natural amphitheater on the side of the mountain where they believe Jesus may have given this sermon. It's a location, as you can see, overlooking the Sea of Galilee above Capernaum. And it's a place where a speaker might be heard by thousands of people down the slopes, even without any artificial amplification. There's sort of a natural amplification in the amphitheater. But like everything in this carefully recounted sermon, there's so much more to the story than just that. Who else in the Bible, for those of you who know, who else in the Bible went up a mountain and came down with some teaching? Moses. In fact, in the ancient world, in general, mountains were understood to be places where the gods might descend, where they might be encountered by mortals, places of revelation where the gods would speak. Matthew here is deliberately likening Jesus to Moses. And we see this not just in this immediate passage, but throughout the book of Matthew. Matthew takes great pains to draw these parallels of Jesus to Moses. We don't have time to explore all of that, but here in Matthew's gospel, he shows that Jesus isn't just another Moses, but is the one greater than Moses, who supersedes Moses, fulfilling the law of Moses and bringing in his own new, more powerful teaching. And while he directs his teaching to his disciples, they're his kind of super fans who are committed to following him day in, day out, it's clear from later in the text that the crowds also heard his teaching and were amazed at its authority and power. So, who can learn from the Sermon on the Mount? Who's it for? Well, clearly the Sermon on the Mount has special relevance for those who identify as followers of Jesus. But it's also an open invitation to all who would listen to embrace a better way, to enter into the reign or the kingdom of God. Indeed, as one expert on the sermon says, the hearing, understanding, and obeying moves one from being part of the crowd to being a disciple. Where are you at today? Are you part of the crowd? Amazed or interested? Or are you one of the disciples? One who has committed to following Jesus day in, day out? Maybe you've been the latter, but of late you've drifted back into the crowd. You still respect and admire Jesus' teaching, but you're not one who follows after him day in, day out, who takes his words to heart and attempts to live them out in your everyday. Well, at the outset, I mentioned 2 10-minute that changed my world. The first, the song, followed by encouraging words that set me on a new path into music and then into ministry. The second actually happened at about the same time, within a few months, and was also made up of 2 parts. A 5-minute altar call or invitation to follow Jesus, and then a further 5 minutes in which I found myself standing at the front of a small country church praying a prayer to follow Jesus. How I ended up there is a longer story, some of which I've told in the past. But in short, I was captivated by the teaching of Jesus, especially in this 10-minute summary sermon that we call the Sermon on the Mount. The meek, those who mourn, the merciful, the peacemakers, these are the included ones. Surely that created room for everyone, including me. Loving not only your neighbors, but your enemies. Who ever thought that? Doing good without seeking recognition or reward, not judging others, nor being a hypocrite, but having your private life match up to your public one. Not only not harming others, but not even hating them. Somehow, in a way that I couldn't explain, I found all this kind of irresistible. if I'm honest, when I stood in front of that small country congregation, I still wasn't even sure if I believed in God. But as the pastor led me in a short public prayer, my private prayer was this: God, I don't even know if you're real, but if you are, I want to live this way. These are the values that I want to live by. Well, that 10 minutes also sent me on an entirely unexpected path to knowing Jesus, to believing in God, and to where I am today. It moved me from a crowd who'd been listening to a disciple who was trying to follow after him. So how about you? Where does January 5, 2025 find you in your journey in life and faith? Let me kind of be a bit more pointed. Have you ever made the decision to follow after this Jesus, this remarkable man who gave this remarkable teaching? Have you ever moved from the crowd to being a follower? I was 17 when I made that shift. So a special challenge today to those of you who are in your teens, maybe part of our Dig Deeper team, or otherwise you're here today. You might have heard about Jesus all your life. You might have been part of the crowd that goes along many Sundays, but maybe you haven't allowed 10 minutes to change your world, move you from the crowd to being a follower. But today, maybe you see, you hear, or you sense something in the teaching of Jesus as you understand it that you can't turn away from, that you sense somehow you need to respond to. Like me those years ago, you can make that decision today. You don't need to have all the answers yet. And if that's you, then I just want to open up the invitation. You can come down the front during our next bracket of songs. Jill or I, Isaac, one of us will be around. We'd love to chat with you, pray with you, and talk about next steps with you. Of course, if all of this is new to you, and you're just for the first time kind of finding yourself in the crowd, hearing about all of this, and we haven't even really gone far in yet, so if that's the case for you, then let me invite you to join us for this series. And if at the end you don't like what you hear, you can tap out, no hard feelings. But perhaps by the end, you'll be in some way amazed, as the crowds back then were, and maybe even ready to move from crowd to follower. Well, wherever you're at, here is my challenge to each of us this week as we kick off this series. Just as 2 lots of 10 minutes changed my world those years ago, maybe all of us can take 2 lots of 10 minutes this week to start not just a New Year's resolution, but a New Year's revolution. Because I don't know about you and where you're at, if you've been a long-time follower of Jesus, but the end of 2024 was kind of a little bumpy for my family. And I've got to admit that I'm feeling a little spiritually and mentally, emotionally dry at the end of all of that and at the start of 2025. So much so that I don't need another New Year's resolution. But I do need a New Year's revolution in my spiritual walk. I need to find afresh the power and encounter the power and impact of Jesus' teaching and his call about the kingdom of God. So I don't want to ask anything of you that I'm not going to ask of me. In fact, not everyone has the luxury of being able to do this, but I'm going to take a week of leave this week just to kind of soak afresh in the scriptures and prayer, to read and reflect and pray. And when I do so, I'm going to read this 10-minute sermon at least once every day this week, just to soak in it. I might take a little bit more than 10 minutes, so I've got time to chill. You don't have to set a timer, by the way. You don't have to do it in 10 minutes. You can take longer if you want to. Because for 5 years, I was a professional performer. And the danger is, this becomes a professional performance. I don't want to be a professional performer anymore. I want this to be authentic. And so I'm going to take that time this week and ask God to bring about that New Year's revolution in my heart and soul again. So my challenge is, will you join me? You don't have to do it every day. What about just twice? Twice this week to read through the Sermon on the Mount. Now, if you're visiting, you don't have a Bible, you don't know where to find the Sermon on the Mount, apart from the kind of rough introduction I gave you, then we have some Bibles which we would love to give you one of. As a gift, we can point out to you where the Sermon on the Mount is. If you're looking up online or an app, then we recommend the New International Version or the New Living Translation, a more contemporary translation like that. But 2 by 10 minutes this week, will you join me in this 2 by 10 minute challenge? You may not understand all of it at first. Or you may have read it so many times that it just sort of seems to pass you by without any of it sinking in. But as we journey into this transformative text in the weeks ahead, perhaps let's just open ourselves up to what the Spirit of God might say to us afresh as we engage with this sermon. Well, we're going to sing now, and as we do, if something stirred inside of you when I asked earlier if you'd ever made that decision yourself to follow Jesus, or if something starts to well up in you during the words of this next song too, then I invite you again to come down or turn to someone near you if you're more comfortable, a family member, someone that you came with, or come and speak to one of us if you'd rather. Jill and I will be here. As I said, Isaac will be around. We'd love to help you to take your next step with Jesus. Thanks, team.